I'd like to welcome you on to the Blue Politics AMA. I am here with Marianne Williamson, who has a book called A Politics of Love, a handbook for a new American Revolution, as well as a podcast called the Marianne Williamson Podcast, available on everywhere you can stream podcasts. How you doing
I'm
today?
fine, thank you.
All right, so a user wants to know what kind of elevator pitch would you give to convince someone of your basic worldview?
I would say that I believe love can be the guiding principle of human civilization, that right now economic values are the guiding principle of human civilization, and those values are not just. They favor the uh, exaltation of short term profit maximization for huge multinational corporate interests and those on the planet who are extremely wealthy at the expense of the vast majority of people and at the expense of the planet itself. And as a consequence, we are on a dangerous trajectory towards possibility of calamitous results even more than we have already experienced. I would say that there is another way we could order civilization, one that is a far more adequate container, excuse me,
Yeah,
for
no
the
problem.
for the energies that are trying to emerge on the planet at this time. And that has to do with putting humanitarian values, making humanitarian values our bottom line as opposed to economic values. And that this is not only possible, but it represents the only survivable, sustainable, and thrivable option for the human race over the next 100 years.
So, if you could pass one law federally across the United States, what would it be?
Getting money out of politics.
So, with recent confirmation of one of Biden's advisors who've taken quite a bit of money from big tech and all that, you think this sets a dangerous precedent, or is this just um, status quo?
It's not an issue of one person. It's an issue of a problem that has been with us ever since about the 1990s is when it really came to the fore. It began with the Supreme Court ruling that money is free speech. And then it climaxed a few years ago with the Citizens United decision that gave corporations unlimited power for undue influence on our political campaigns. So, just taking on an example of one person's financial influence doesn't really strike at the heart of the problem. Given the current makeup of the Supreme Court, it's not reasonable to assume that we can overturn Citizens United anytime soon, but we can aim for a constitutional amendment that will establish public funding for federal campaigns and also many other ways that we can, in gerrymandering and so forth, in voter suppression efforts. What we need to do is shore up our democracy. I'm a great believer in democracy, in the radicalism of the American experiment. The problem right now is that the flow of democracy itself is being blocked. I believe that the founders had a brilliant idea, radical then and radical now, which is that if people have free public education and access to a free press and access to public assembly, then more often than not, their wisdom would rise to the top. And that in the final analysis, that is the only force that we should consider uh, good enough to govern a nation. The problem right now is not that democracy is any less powerful. The problem is that our democracy is blocked. And that's what we need to fix.
So, would you run for president again? And if so, would it be under a third party such as the People's Party or the Green Party?
I don't know if I would run again. I ran before because I got a gut call that was unmistakable. I have no idea if I will ever get that gut call again. I don't think anyone runs for president. I can't imagine anyone running for president who doesn't feel some level of that gut call, because it's a very difficult thing to do. It's brutal out there. Politics is a blood sport. If I ever, forgive me for all the sirens, I don't know what's going on outside my window, but clearly something's going on out there. So forgive me for the sounds. Um, if I ever feel that again, then I would run. But if I don't feel that again, then I will continue to do whatever I can to promote ideas, but not as a candidate. So the answer to your question is I don't know. In terms of third party versus Democratic Party, I live with the same questions in my heart that a lot of people are living with right now, about that issue. And I think for me, as for a lot of people, the decision's not made yet. There's a lot of risk in um, there's risk in third party, but there's also a lot of value in third party. I, abolition came from the abolitionist party, women's suffrage came from the women's party, social security came from the socialist party. Traditionally in the United States, third party voices have been extremely important, but we also know what the risks are as well. So I don't, the answer, and when I ran for Congress, I did run as an independent, and I found how in a congressional race that was very naive because of the way the duopoly had the system set up to exclude anyone who was not part of that system, which is the problem. So I don't have anything new or unique to say to that issue. I'll just say that I live with it in my heart, like most people I know do.
Yeah, a lot of Democrats feel like they're being sidelined by
Well,
the DNC.
because they are, and I can tell you from having been inside that beast, in the belly of the beast, they're not incorrect uh, with that assessment. But we also know what the risk is. So it's a well, I think we'll know a lot more in the next year. We'll know a lot more about that. I think a lot is playing out as we speak.
Well, yeah, there's reports that the Democrat strategy for 2022 is focusing all in on QAnon, and the main. Do you think this is like a sign that the Democrats become complacent, even though that they didn't even win by that big of a margin in the swing states?
I think calling them complacent is too charitable. Um, Making their strategy about QAnon, and I don't know if it's true, but I have heard it as well, who knows, is a terrible idea. If they want to win in 2022, this is what they would do, in my opinion. Everybody should get $2,000 a month retroactively to the beginning of the pandemic, at least till the end of the pandemic, possibly 3 months in addition. They should cancel the entirety of the college loan debt. They should make college at community colleges free and state universities free, and begin work on a Green New Deal. That's how you win in 22. In fact, I think they'd have a real hard time losing for a long, long time after that. So, making it about QAnon is a really, really dumb idea in my book.
Oh, speaking of the Green New Deal, we all know about the Texas blackouts, and sadly, some people um, that were planning on watching are now dealing with the Texas blackouts. And currently, it's been, I think, 2 or 3 days without electricity. Do you think that this will increase support for Green New Deal, or is that just being too optimistic?
Well, I was born and raised in Texas. I have family there now. So I not only feel very deeply um, the horror of this moment, but I also have memories of how this orgiastic drive towards privatization and deregulation first came upon Texas in the 1970s and the 1980s. This is what happens when you make the free market um, trickle down propaganda. You make it like they made it like a perverse religion. Texas priding itself on this kind of privatized world and deregulated world. If you look at ERCO, which is the government uh, nonprofit that runs their electrical grid, all of the people who run it are fossil fuel guys, practically to the last person. So yes, of course, progressives in Texas and progressives elsewhere are saying, we've got you. You guys are busted. This has got to stop. And of course, what's happening already is Greg Abbott, the governor, is already on Fox television telling us that the problem is the wind and solar. Now, wind turbines were 10%, something like 10%, and they were supposed to be backup. So they're already trying to cover their you-know-whats. They're already lying and spinning um, and deflecting. So, because what's going to happen at the end of this, there's going to be a whole lot of questions. There's going to be, I would think, a whole lot of criminal cases. There can be a lot of questions: who knew what when? Because the more you read about this right now, they knew that they were not weatherized. But these guys said, well, when is it going to get that cold in Texas? And it would cost so much money to weatherize that they chose not to do it. So there are going to be a lot of questions about who knew what when. But you've already got someone. They're already on it. They're already so scared of that. Even in the middle of it, before it's even fixed, you've got people like Rick Perry coming out today saying that Texans would rather have 3 days without power than have a bunch of lefties come in with their top-down radical agenda. Well, first of all, I don't think he can speak for all those people who are in big, big trouble right now, some of them suffering very, very greatly. And also the idea that government should do the bare minimum to ensure the safety of its citizens is not a radical top-down idea. What's radical is the idea that government should not. And that radical idea was introduced in 1980 by the presidency of Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan said government is the problem. He said the most dangerous, terrifying words in the English language, he said, are, I'm from the government, I'm here to help. And that was the propaganda that they used to basically corporatize and privatize and deregulate the country. And what we're experiencing now in many, many areas is the consequence of that.
So, on the somewhat topic of Texas, what's your opinion on gun ownership?
What are you asking me about gun ownership?
Do you think that like gun ownership is a fundamental right of all Americans?
Well, yes, actually, when we have a Second Amendment, the right to bear arms. And listen, I don't even disagree with the conservatives about why the founders put them there. However, I believe that there should be universal background checks. One of the first things that Trump did, I think it was his first official act when he became president, was to repeal the rule that the Obama administration made that people who had been deemed criminally insane should not be able to buy guns. So I believe there should be strict common sense gun safety laws. But yes, I believe that the Bill of Rights gives us the right to Americans the right to bear arms. And we want to be real careful messing with the Bill of Rights, because if we start messing with the Second Amendment, those guys are going to start wanting to mess with some others. And we don't want that. But strict common sense gun safety laws, absolutely, I believe.
So I'm guessing you're not a fan of the idea of banning handguns in cities.
In where?
In cities.
I think that's, I can't imagine that getting, I can't imagine that getting past a Second Amendment challenge. Um, I would, that one, I mean, I haven't even thought about that, but no, I mean, we have a Second Amendment, but the idea that, there should be universal background check. We should get rid of the loopholes for gun shows. People who have had any kind of violent activity and their behavior that is proven should not have access to a gun. There should be strict child safety locks. Um, there should be strict, implementation of some of the laws that we already have that are not strictly implemented. And of course, I'm not for open carry, but I understand that something like that would have a difficult time uh, getting past Second Amendment challenge.
So, how do you think Biden has been doing?
Listen, and
Um,
many of the things that Biden has been doing, I applaud. I applaud the fact that he has a task force to reunite those children at the border with their families. I applaud that he has already done things to make it easier for the DACA students. I applaud that he has denied the permit to the Keystone Pipeline. I applaud that he has clearly indicated that climate change is given a top priority in his administration. I applaud that he has stopped the sale of arms to Saudi Arabia, that he has stopped the aerial support that enables them to prosecute a genocidal war in Yemen. So there are many things where I applaud him, and other things where, I definitely am to the left of this president. This idea, even the things he said last night about not canceling the college loan debt. I don't understand it. Also, he said he doesn't even believe he has the power. Well, yes, he does have the power. I would want to cancel all the college loan debt. I would want the 2,000. Once again, he promised. And so there are areas where I am very, very much to the left of the president, although, this is who we knew we were electing, so I'm not that surprised. And I'm still glad he beat Trump, because I believe that Trump winning a second term would have spelled the end of our democracy as we know it.
what's your thoughts on Biden's stance on Israel and BDS?
Well, I don't think that he has really said much about Israel yet. I mean, Blinken, from what I know, they said that they're keeping uh, they're keeping the embassy in Jerusalem, which is, if anybody knows the situation, uh, all they've done is rented a room. I mean, this thing about the embassy in Jerusalem is mainly symbolic, but it's an important symbol, because I think it was very insulting to move it there. But on the other hand, it is the capital. So, I think for him to say, no, we're going to go back to Tel Aviv, I'm not sure it matters that much. In terms of BDS, I am ambivalent about BDS. I see both sides of the BDS argument. I, I think when Obama was president, Obama stood up to Netanyahu. And Biden needs to step up to Netanyahu. Netanyahu in Israel is not that different than Trump. And I believe that his policies are not only terrible for the world, not only terrible for the Palestinians, I think his policies are terrible for Israel. And he has completely given up basically on a two-state solution. And I will be very disappointed if Blinken does not make it clear in a way that Obama did, and that Trump obviously did not, that the rights of the Palestinians are as important to us as is Israeli security.
So, Andrew Yang had some things to say about the BDS movement, and he said that, quote, it was rooted in anti-Semitic thought and history, harkening back to the fascist boycotts of Jewish businesses. Is that a bit
You
extreme?
know, Andrew's running, what can I tell you? Andrew's running for mayor in New York City. On the other hand, I would remind my friend Andrew that there are many Jews in New York City who are not right-wing on the subject of Israel. So no, I do not agree with him on that. I don't agree with him on that. The idea of boycotting Jewish businesses does, in and of itself, harkens back to some terrible historical realities. However, I think it's very disingenuous to talk about BDS in those terms. I do believe that in very troublesome ways, the American left is infected with some anti-Semitism, but not on the issue of BDS. On the issue of BDS, it's a legitimate, I even though, like I said, I have ambivalence about it. I see the value, I see the good, I see the bad, but even the part of me that sees value, that would disagree with it, does not disagree with it based on historical memory. No, I do not agree with my friend Andrew on that. And I'm surprised that he's going there, actually.
Aside from his takes on the BDS movement,
Pardon?
What do you think, aside from Andrew Yang's take on the BDS movement, how do you feel about his how about his run for mayor in overall?
I like Andrew a lot as a person. I like his spirit. I like his gumption. I like his enthusiasm. What I found when he was running for president, I felt that his stump speech was absolutely extraordinary. Once the Q&A started and other issues, he was asked about other issues, I was kind of startled by what seemed in certain situations to be a bit of disinterest or lack of knowledge about other issues. So um, in terms of his run for mayor, I I just think he's a wonderful presence in politics. But the people of New York City obviously will have to make a decision. I have lived in New York. Was living in New York for the last 2 years, even before um, the campaign, but I don't live there now. And so I'm not following closely some of what the New York City issues are right now. And so I don't want to speak. I think he's an important voice, but whether and I certainly support his candidacy. That doesn't mean, however, that I necessarily support everything, and that's true of any candidate that you support. I supported Biden. That doesn't mean I agree with everything he said.
So, on a different note, Rush Limbaugh passed away today, and he's made a lot of controversial remarks. But what do you think his legacy will be in the greater political sphere?
I don't want to speak irreverently of the dead, but his legacy is hate, and that's simply true. He, I am old enough to remember when Bill Clinton was elected president, and no one has ever doubted that he was the democratically elected president. From the first day he was in office, Limbaugh would get on his radio show every day and say, America held hostage. Day, however many days we've been president, we were held hostage. He was the one who started this, your president, like he wasn't everybody else's president. Um, I know that his soul is innocent like everyone else's is, but you asked me what his legacy was politically, and his legacy, unfortunately, is bigotry, racism, and hatred, and anger. And I hope
So,
that we will all work assiduously to correct that.
so do you think we should utilize pain and anger that a lot of people have around Rush Limbaugh to turn it into something positive, like reinstating the fairness doctrine? Um,
I do think it's interesting that you mentioned that. The Fairness Doctrine was abolished by Ronald Reagan in 1987. Absolutely, I think that we should reinstate the Fairness Doctrine. Of course, it's complicated now because that was before social media platforms. It was before high tech. So, and so the Fairness Doctrine applied to all broadcast licensees. We definitely need a new. Version of the Fairness Doctrine. We also, it was Bill Clinton who passed the Telecommunications Act in 1996, which allowed for the corporatization of um, mass media, news media sources. We need to smash that to bits. We need to smash Facebook to bits. We need to remember that we're supposed to have antitrust laws in this country. And we have got to, not only on the level of policy, but on the level of our own hearts, purify ourselves of the anger that will ultimately destroy us if we do not.
um, do you believe that national unity is even possible now?
Well, let's talk about this. Democracy, by definition, is a cacophony of voices. The idea that we don't all agree is not of itself a bad thing. That of itself is a good thing. Unity in diversity means that we held to the idea of out of many one, that we would be many voices, many religions, many ethnicities, many cultures, sexes, sexuality. So what's happening now is that the full embodiment of that idea is being tested as never before. It began as an ideal, but even some of the people who codified the ideal were themselves slave owners. So they weren't manifesting it. America has held in every generation those who wished to expand the democratic franchise. And there have also been in every generation those who worked against that. Now, what the ideal is that we have different ideas. Nobody has a monopoly on the truth. Everybody's screaming and shouting. That of itself is a good thing. That's the American public domain. However, the unity ideal was not that we would all agree, but that we would have common fealty to certain first principles, such as all people are created equal. All people are given inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That we would be, that we would have religious freedom here. That people are free to believe however they believe, including not believing. That we would have a free press. That we would have a commitment to public education. That we would be unified by our first principles. And that is what is so dangerous right now, including the fact that we're not even teaching our children these first principles in so many cases. We have 11 states in the United States that don't even require half a year of American government, American civics, American history. I mean, there's an astonishing ignorance among way too many Americans of what this country is even supposed to stand for. And that's what's so dangerous, in my opinion. When I was a younger woman, it wasn't, I'm not whitewashing American capitalism before 1980. I'm not romanticizing our history, but I can honestly say I grew up in a time not where America was perfect, but where there was a social consensus we were supposed to try. It wasn't that there weren't racists or bigots or anti-Semites or homophobes or anything like that. But there was the realization we're not supposed to be that. And that the betterment of society lies in those voices being so peripheralized as to never carry with them real political weight. And you didn't get a sense that either the Democrats or the Republicans would ever give such people a heavy political megaphone again. With the Trump presidency, what began to happen over the last few years was two different things. Number one was social media. Even the most hateful voices can have a platform. Thank you, Mark Zuckerberg and others who could have nipped this stuff in the bud. But also we have a president who legitimized these voices, who didn't have a problem exploiting them for his own political purposes. So now we have those voices shouting too loud. Shouting at all is bad, but the problem is, as I said, there's not enough of a counterweight, which is enough Americans who are very clear that is not what America is supposed to be. So one of the most important things is that we begin to teach our children again what this country is supposed to be, so that we're not so vulnerable to those who would make it otherwise.
So what is your reaction to the acquittal of former President Trump, even though Mitch McConnell even said that he was guilty right after voting he was not guilty?
Well, Mitch McConnell is the one who said that he would not allow the Senate impeachment trial to be done while Trump was still in office. Then he can't, he wants to have it both ways. Then now he says that the reason he didn't vote to convict was because he was a former president. But he was the trial was when he was a former president, only because Mitch McConnell wouldn't allow it to be done sooner. He's quite a Machiavellian character. What Mitch McConnell is trying to do, it's very obvious and fascinating to watch, is that there is clearly a war within the Republican Party. And he's laying claim to the Republican Party that has jettisoned Donald Trump. And then you have someone like Lindsey Graham who says the Republican Party is Donald Trump and that we need him in order to stay in power. I don't know. That's for Republicans to work out. I'm not a Republican, but we have our own struggles on the left that it's going to be people within the Republican Party who are going to have to work that out. I was kind of impressed by some of the Republicans who did vote to convict, because they obviously do that at their political peril. I mean, someone like Susan Collins just won, so she doesn't have to worry. But others have every reason to believe Trump will come after them in their primaries. And it's just sad that there are so many Republicans who will vote their party over their country, over the Constitution, over democracy. It's unbelievable. In the farewell address of George Washington, he warns us against political parties. And he says that political parties will create factions of men who will be more interested in their party than in their country. And that is clearly true. It's very sad because I remember a Republican Party of righteousness. And I think, there are high-minded conservative principles. I respect that. Eisenhower said the American mind at its best is both liberal and conservative. And I believe that at their best, they're high-minded. But the Republican Party today does not stand for high-minded conservative principles. And that's to the detriment of this country, for sure.
So you've been a constant advocate for peace, even wanting to create the Department of Peace. With that in mind, how would a Williamson administration handle an attack on U.S. soil from a foreign power?
Well, first of all, I'm not saying when you're talking about an attack on US soil by a foreign power, I mean, goodness, I'm not a pacifist. I'm not saying that we don't need a military. And the President of the United States is Commander in Chief of the US Armed Forces. So obviously, armed forces would be called to task if, God forbid, um, that reality were to occur. But we have to step back and look at what's going on here. Our defense budget is something around $760 billion a year. This is probably about 300 billion more than the military even says that they need. Our military budget is based less on actual military needs and even more so on profit maximization, short-term profit maximization for defense contractors, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, Boeing, et cetera. And that's, once again, it was a Republican president, Dwight Eisenhower, who warned us in his farewell of the military industrial complex. And this is not only the corruption of our military budget, it is also what has become a corruption of our diplomatic forces. So you have about $760 billion as your defense budget. You have $40 billion as your State Department budget. And what has happened over the last really couple of decades is that the military influence on our State Department is so great. There's a book by Ronan Farrow called War on Peace, which talks about this quite a lot. Whereas, let's say, decades ago, you were talking about a foreign policy issue and the State Department, the diplomatic corps is sitting at the table and the military guys are in the back of the room sitting in the chairs behind them. Today, more likely, it's the opposite. It used to be that if American foreign policy were being talked about at the highest levels of our government, and somebody said, well, we have to have, that could be a problem. The State Department would have a problem with that. If that line, State Department would have a problem with it today at one of those meetings, people would roll their eyes and snicker because nobody really cares. That's why I'll give you an example. When we were originally when Obama was selling the arms to Saudi Arabia, what the Obama administration said when any kind of moral questions were brought up about this, the Obama administration said, yeah, well, they're not going to use it, so we really don't have to worry. Well, hello. They started using them big time to prosecute this war against Yemen. Tens of thousands of people have starved, including children. When Mike Pompeo was asked about this, his response was particularly horrifying to me. His response was, sometimes you have strategic partnerships with people who do not share your values. In Mike Pompeo, who was the Secretary of state. But his idea of strategic partnerships had to do with profit maximization for the defense contractors selling those arms, rather than the moral authority of the United States. So if I were president, the State Department and diplomacy would have a much larger part to play in American foreign policy. The defense budget would be in keeping with what the military said that they needed, not what defense contractors said they wanted. To be honest, I have deep questions about whether or not uh, defense should even be private industry. I mean, the corruption of our healthcare system is that it's a profit-making system. And as long as war is such good business and such big business, we are traveling a very, very dangerous path. The reason I wanted a Department of Peace, this idea I first heard about from former Congressman Dennis Kucinich, what a Department of Peace would be. Right now we have a military academy. So somebody goes and they get educated on the military arts, as it were, and then in exchange for that education, then they give to their country a certain number of years working within the military establishment. We need a peace academy where people come to learn the skills and the arts and the resources of peace building. Peace building is a very specific thing. There are 4 factors which statistically indicate that there will be a higher incidence of peace and a lower incidence of conflict. That has to do with the expansion of economic opportunities for women, the expansion of educational opportunities for children, the reduction of violence against women, and the amelioration of unnecessary human suffering wherever possible. So if people came to a peace building academy, they got their education in peace building skills, then, and also that would have a domestic as well as international counterpart, because many of the peace building skills that you learn have as much application in, let's say, East Los Angeles as they have in the Congo. So um, right now we give a lot of money, a lot of resources, and a lot of attention to ways to wage war. And even there, so much of our attention to waging war has to do with warfare that had more applicability to possibilities in the 20th century. It's not even the way war would be waged today. For instance, you look at something like cybersecurity. We actually don't give as much attention to cyber war as we probably should in 2021. Why? Because Northrop Grumman has no money to be made there. Boeing, et cetera. This is a very, very corrupt situation in our country. And as I said, there would be far more concentration on humanitarian assistance, the role that a humanitarian assistance plays in building up peace. You don't just fight sickness, you try to prevent sickness by cultivating health. Well, you don't just, if you're sane, learn to fight war. You wage peace, you try to prevent war by cultivating the conditions of peace. But if we even have that conversation, we have to fight, we have to face the dirty little secret, which is how much money there is to be made on war.
On a similar topic, what do you think of the Patriot Act and the bipartisan effort that's currently going on to destroy end-to-end encryption in the Congress and Senate?
The Patriot Act is horrible. When people passed it after 9/11, most of the people who voted for it had not even read it. And every year they continue with the authorization of military force, which is what enables our president to completely override the constitutional um, uh, injunction that Congress has to declare war. And instead, the president, under the guise of fighting terrorism, can do pretty much whatever he or she wants. It's terrible. And it has been unfortunately, a bipartisan support, which enables this to continue. It's just Congress abdicating their own responsibility, because basically of how much work it would take for them to actually know more about what's going on.
One of our users has a very interesting question. Should Andrew Cuomo resign?
I don't know. Like I said, I'm not living in New York. I've read about the situation, but not enough to have an opinion about it. And
All right.
ultimately, I think ultimately this is for the people of New York to decide. Just like the people, just like with Andrew, it's really for the people of the city of New York to decide. That's why I don't think that Al Franken should have resigned. It was for the people of Minnesota to decide. I mean, that balance of the states and the federals is very important in this country, and it is as important for the left as it is for the right.
So, with Biden trying to reunite families, should we levy criminal charges against those who ran the ICE detention camps for their uh, neglecting children and leaving them to die from sickness or forcibly sterilizing women who came into their facilities?
Damn right. This was way more than neglecting children. This was state-sponsored kidnapping. This was state-sponsored child abuse. This is, if your government does it, that doesn't make it less of a crime. These children were kidnapped as a method of basically a foreign policy. And I hope that people such as Stephen Miller and others will be absolutely held fully accountable for their crimes.
So, do you believe in lesser or more immigration restrictions?
It's not about lesser or more. What Trump did is he perverted them. I mean, he closed so many of the centers where people could um, basically achieve asylum. This is an example of what I meant by Americans not even knowing our history. People being able to come here from countries where they are horribly mistreated and abused, which would be my own grandparents, by the way, seeking asylum in the United States. You can't get a more basic pillar of the American ideal than people coming here to find asylum. This is a beautiful aspect of who we are. Immigration, the flow of immigration, the genius that comes about, the regeneration that comes about in the psychic bloodstream of our society because of immigration. This is something we value. So, if we were talking about the 1970s, you know what you did in order to become legally documented if you were in the 1970s? You know what you did? You walked over to the registration office and you signed a piece of paper. And even um, Ronald Reagan gave amnesty to, I can't remember if it was 8 million people or 11 million people. So I totally support Biden's efforts to put 11 million people, the undocumented people in the United States, on the path to citizenship. There is no other way to handle this. And then both Democrats and Republicans need to clean up the entire system by which legal immigration is attained and done correctly in this country.
So, one of our users wants to ask, how do you explain the gap between white incomes and black incomes, which has grown immensely since the 1970s, despite the mass strides in civil rights?
Yeah, if black families made as much as white families, we would have an economy that was $1.5 trillion larger. When you ask, how do you explain it? It's called slavery. Slavery ended in 1865. And then after that, except for 12 years of Reconstruction, you had another 100 years before the Civil Rights Act in 1964. The Black Code laws, which were instituted in the South at the end of Reconstruction, guaranteed, they were throughout the South, and they guaranteed subpar economic, social, and political opportunity for Black people in America. In 1964, the Voting Rights Act dismantled the infrastructure of segregation. Excuse me, the Civil Rights Act. Then in 1965, the Voting Rights Act allowed for universal access to the polls. The Supreme Court started chipping away at that in 2013, which is why we have these horrific voting suppression efforts around the country. My point, however, is that 64, you have the Civil Rights Act. 65, you have the Voting Rights Act. And guess what happened in 1968? Martin Luther King was killed. And then also in 1968, Richard Nixon was elected president because they had assassinated Bobby Kennedy. Hello. So Richard Nixon becomes president, and his One of his domestic advisors was a man named Daniel Patrick Moynihan. And Daniel Patrick Moynihan later became senator from New York. So, he phrased the really sick phrase, he called it benign neglect. His advice to Nixon was enough is enough. There's been so much racial tumult. They got the Civil Rights Act. They got the Voting Rights Act. We had the Voting Rights Movement. We need some quiet on the home front regarding race. He called it benign neglect. And so what happened was the issue of the economic gap, that unfair economic gap, was never addressed. Remember, at the end of the Civil War, when slavery was abolished as an institution, the historians believe there were anywhere between 4 and 5 million formerly enslaved people. They were promised at the time by General Tecumseh Sherman that every formerly enslaved family of 4 would receive 40 acres and a mule, which would give them an opportunity to make a living and start their own life. I mean, God knows they knew how to till the soil and work a farm. Why? Because they'd been working everybody else's plantation. Unfortunately, in the vast majority of cases, the land was not given, the mule was not given, even when they were, in most cases, that was then taken away. So that gap has simply not been closed. That is why I feel so strongly about reparations. Until we pay reparations, and then, by the way, we should also note that things got worse. I mean, when you look at things like mass incarceration, when you look at the fact that racial disparity in sentencing, if a Black person is liable to get a 20% longer prison sentence for the same crime committed by a white person, all of these things just continue the legacy of generational poverty and generational injustices. That is why I feel so strongly about reparations.
So with the 13th Amendment, it states that slavery is prohibited unless punishment for a crime.
Yeah, and
Do you
that
believe,
certainly, yeah, of course, that needs to be ended, because that's part of the injustice of the prison industrial complex.
is it troubling that we have a vice president who utilized that clause to basically round up minority groups and force them to work for the state for very low wages?
Like I said before, um, when you vote for someone, as I voted for Biden and I voted for Harris, that doesn't mean I agreed with everything they'd ever done. So is that troubling? Yes, it's troubling. Do I prefer her to Mike Pence? You better believe it. What's most troubling about all that, and I say this as someone who ran, is the whole decision-making process by which the candidate is chosen to begin with.
So, on a different note, what are your thoughts on cryptocurrency and do you hold any?
I am a very beginning student. A lot of it at this point goes over my head. I'm learning, but I don't know enough and understand enough to have an opinion. I'm I find the whole thing kind of mind blowing, and I don't understand enough of it yet.
Do you think crypto is the future, or do you think the federal government will eventually just clamp it down so hard that it's just not worth it anymore?
I find that a fascinating question. I would tend to think the former, but I would also tend to think the latter. Uh, Sometimes I'm surprised it's been allowed to go as far as it's gone. Uh, I don't know. This is a fascinating, uh, it's a fascinating phenomenon. But I don't have anything particularly intelligent to say. Like I said, um, I'm I have way more questions than I have many answers to proffer.
All right, so one of our users wants to ask, should we be harder on China?
You know, people used to say to me during the Trump years, "Is there anything that Trump has done that you like?" And I used to say, "Yeah, he's been more honest about China." His policies, like in so many areas, didn't in any way match what he was saying. But when you look at the issue of the Uyghurs, when you look at the issue of Hong Kong, when you look at the issue of how we have just allowed American corporations to be such whores for the money, going over there, willing to give, we've had laws for a long time that if a company goes over to China, couldn't give up anything that was related to military secrets. Well, at this point, anything that you give up related to tech secrets is essentially a security issue. So the fact that American corporations have been able to, for the sake of the money that they could make there, get the American government to be so lenient, yes, I think those things do need to stop. And I think that there's a big, big difference between the Chinese people and the communist government of China. So I guess my answer is yes.
What is your thoughts on the whole Alex, Alexei Navalny situation in Russia?
Oh, what a brave man. What a brave man. And what brave people there are there, as in Myanmar, as in so many places where I just have such admiration. Uh, Putin is not a nice man. And, he clearly tried to kill Navalny. And obviously, I doubt, what was he given the other day, a 2 or 3 year prison sentence? One can only imagine what will happen to him. I have great, great admiration. I mean, he didn't have to go back. And he certainly, I'm sure, realized what might happen to him if he did. I mean, they didn't even let him off the plane. Um, I'm looking very closely at Anthony Blinken, our new Secretary of State, how some of these things will be handled. We must return moral authority to the foreign policy of the United States. On the other hand, we have to reclaim our own moral authority. We can't just go around telling other people how they should practice democracy when the whole world has seen us ourselves fall so short of our purported goals and ideals. But yes, I hope the United States, in whatever way possible, takes a stand for Navalny.
Did you watch the Putin's Palace documentary they released on YouTube?
No, I would like to. I've seen pictures of his palace. I believe it. I have no reason not to believe it. No, I'll have to go. So it's on YouTube, huh? A picture of his palace out there in the woods.
Quite. It's you have to read fast though, since it's like 2 hours, but he speaks very fast in Russian, so
Uh,
all subtitles.
yeah, well, we know about the billions and billions and billions of dollars of the Russian oligarchs. We know how much goes to him. So he has to spend it on something, right? Uh, so it doesn't surprise me at all. Doesn't surprise me at all.
All right, we are gonna wrap up with one of our last questions. What are your thoughts on defunding the police?
Uh, we have a huge problem here, and it goes deeper than money. Clearly, the police have been infiltrated by some right-wing fascist uh, authoritarian forces from Oath Keepers and other white supremacist groups. Some of the stories that you hear that appear to be true are absolutely horrifying, and also the things we continue to see happen. Money is part of it, definitely. And I definitely believe not only that much of that money, when you look at the billions and billions of dollars spent on our police departments, needs to go to such things as social work services, et cetera, that would be provided in mental health cases, but it goes deeper than that as well. I think we need to look at the training for our police. If you compare the training of American police compared to German, for instance, look at the police in Germany. Look how much longer they go through training. Look how much more of a professional assignment it is. And look how much in other countries, how much more training there is in non-lethal force. Also, going back to the undue influence of the military-industrial complex on our military, what they do is they say, oh, God, generals, you got to have this newest airplane. You got to have these newest tanks. You got to have these newer tanks. You got to have these newer outfits. You got to have this newer equipment. So the generals say, well, what are we going to do with the ones we have are perfectly good. So the defense contractors say, send them to the boys at home. And so the culture of the police, even in the eyes of children, has so changed from the idea of a domestic peacekeeper to the militarization of the police throughout our country. I see it as a huge problem. And one of the things that's so huge about it is that there have been situations when we were looking at the BLM protests, et cetera, where it seemed so clear that the mayor and the governor didn't even have control. Because even, the one of two things was happening. Either the mayor and the governor was coming out and saying, I do not want the police to act this way. And then the next day the police would act that way anyway. So what was it? Is it the mayor or the governor was just two-faced? Or was it that the mayor and governor didn't really have control over what was happening? And I fear in too many cases that it was the latter. It's a big problem. Seriously problem. So I think that the use of the word has been made us vulnerable to charges from the right wing, but then they've been defunding education for decades. They've been defunding anti-poverty programs for decades. But right now I understand that the word itself is problematic. On the other hand, if all you say is reform the police, that's too little, because this goes so much deeper than reform. It's like the whole thing needs to be smashed and started over. And it's a big deal. You see things happening now that you go, how could that still be happening, given what we've seen with Eric Garner, given what we've seen with George Floyd, given what we've seen with Trayvon Martin, and the fact that it is still happening shows you what trouble we're in. It's a big
All right. Is there anything that we didn't reach on that you wanted to speak about?
No, I'm cool if you are. It seems to me that you covered a lot of things. I appreciate it. I appreciate you giving me the opportunity to opine about these various issues. Anything you want me to kind of, explain yourself, Ms. Williamson, having this or that view. Otherwise, I'm just grateful that I had a chance to talk to you.
All right. I'd like to thank you for coming on.
Thank you.
Everyone, she has a book that's out called Politics of Love, a handbook for New American Revolution. You can buy it on Amazon, Barnes & Noble's, IndieBound. You can also buy all of her books at marianne.com/books. As well, she has a podcast that's available everywhere you want to stream podcasts. And that is all. I'd like to thank you for coming on.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Talk to you later. Bye.
Talk to you later.
Thanks.